Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. My name is Sarayu, and I'm moderating this session on ID for All in overcoming barriers to inclusion. When I was asked to moderate this panel, I admit I bristled a little. I was a bit irritated about why a woman was being asked to ask the opinions of gentlemen on inclusion. It did cause me discomfort. But the more I thought about it, and some of the conversations earlier today sort of made me think about this. In an environment where questions of inclusion are increasingly under threat, are increasingly being challenged for their validity, this conversation is very, very important, and it's crucial to hear as many voices as there are out there that are championing inclusion. So on that note, I will move the conversation to the panelists and hear their opinions. All of them have extensive work on questions of inclusion in different domains, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Kunal, Barua, my first question is to you. Kunal and I are colleagues, and we'll try our best to keep this from becoming a conversation like in office. But Kunal, the first question to you. You're coming off the back of doing some extraordinary work on gender inclusion, particularly in the context of identity. I would love to know a little bit more about why the lens on gender, and also a little bit more on why gender in a certain way is the gateway to thinking more deeply about questions of inclusion on the ground. And I'd love for you to focus your attention not just on ID systems, but all kinds of digital public systems, including use cases and some of those as well. So over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me on this panel as well, and to the esteemed panelists. Yeah, I think just starting off on the point that you made and using that sort of as the jumping board for it all, the lens of inclusion, of course, takes into consideration a variety of different types of people. And ultimately, when digital systems or transformative systems, especially ones which sort of bolster governance, needs to take into consideration all people. And essentially, that's kind of the lens that we need to take, is to how do we include as opposed to sort of strengthen adoption. And I think that's the lens that we have taken with a lot of the work that we've been able to do. Excuse me. The base level, I think that there's a good amount of evidence, there's a solid body of work behind why marginalized communities and stakeholders tend to remain that way, out of which 50% of the population tends to be women. And I think in a lot of different contexts, socio-normative and just general assumption-based system design tends to continue to invisibilize a lot of the experience, a lot of the overall understanding of how to make systems more gender intentional. And that's essentially why we have tried to take a much more strategic, much more actual, ground-based lens to it. And that's why we wanted to build out something using the gender inclusion lens. And sort of in the question itself, the answer is that it doesn't just provide a lens for a singular thing. It opens up the conversation for a variety of different intersectional, a variety of different types of intersectional understanding. It also provides a great way to understand different personality types or persona types. I think some of the work that we have done in collaboration with MOSIP has really opened the pathways to understanding how different personality types also, which have differential identity traits, often impact or often influence the way in which online and offline interactions happen. So the entire experience of it all really is that if you're able to start thinking about intentional approaches towards specific stakeholders who have maybe been marginalized in historically and continue to be invisibilized to a certain extent, it leads to a much wider sort of lens to be able to think about people who you want to actually help with building out ID systems and sort of services downstream as well. So that's kind of the reason why we've taken that lens, and the sort of more globally, the more we've spoken to people through the research that we've been doing, the intent, I think, or the intent to include has never been a question. But I think now the shift and what we're seeing as part of MOSIP Connect as well and generally in the ecosystem is to start thinking about how to actually address the problem. And essentially, I think that's what we're trying to do through the work that we've done, as well as going forward within the confines of this ecosystem, but also outside of it. So not just digital ID systems is kind of the point. It's DPIs in general, governance systems, critical scale infrastructure, different types of systems. It's not just limited to digital systems. AI is, of course, playing a big role as well. So it's expanding across.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for that, Kunal. I'll bring the conversation to you, Andrew. You have many, many decades, dare I say, of work in bringing identity to refugees and as a part of your work with UNHCR. I'd love to understand a little bit more from your years of operational experience, a little bit about how, or rather what giving identity means. What are some of the challenges that you experience in including as many people, and what drives the determination of the process there?
Thanks very much. And I think I'd like to start with numbers a little bit, just to give everyone a sense of what we're talking about. There are, by the end of the year, roughly 140 million displaced persons or persons at risk of statelessness. So that's bigger than the population of the Philippines. It's about the size of the population of Russia. So we're talking about a quasi-country of people who are incredibly vulnerable, displaced, and what's challenging for refugees is that when they flee their country of origin and end up in a country of asylum, they often come without any documentation whatsoever. So the starting point for those people is lesser often than for others who are from the country where they, they're nationals of the country where they reside. So we work alongside governments to ensure that refugees are identified and that they're registered as quickly as possible. What's interesting about that is that refugees don't often see national identity systems for years and years after they've entered a country, right? So the foundational identity database is actually often sitting with a different government department than, or with UNHCR, because we work, as I said, very closely with governments. So we know the incredible added value of identity, right? Especially for refugees, because I've seen time and time again how registration and the appropriate sort of regulatory framework allows for refugees to get SIM cards, for example, in Uganda, or travel documents in Mozambique, and the list goes on, right? So there are many, many happy stories that come out of registering and providing documentation to refugees. Now, I've seen in many countries where that documentation isn't worth much, right? And refugees don't even come to pick up the documentation because there's no inclusionary benefit to receiving those documents. So again, the policies and regulatory frameworks around identity are key so that the services that refugees should have access to are made available and not restrictive. So that's really in summary what identity is for refugees, I would say.
Thank you very much for that. I'd love to come back to you in the next round of questions to understand a little bit more about the how and some stories from the field, particularly on what you just said, which is that identity has to be layered with other services, and the legal policy framework that drives it is critical. But I'll come back. Kunal, Walia, bringing the conversation to you. I have to use their surnames. We can't today be on a first name basis, but I know Dalberg has been working extensively on questions of inclusion, some more broadly than technology and identity systems, but in general on questions of inclusion. So to sort of bring the conversation around from gender, refugees, to the broader sort of why inclusion. I'd love to hear your views on why inclusion is important, and I also understand you're doing work in helping countries, or anybody actually, understand the problem of inclusion. So over to you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on the panel, and apologies for the gender mix. The question of inclusion is a really important one, and I think at least the people who are attending this conference don't need to be convinced that it's an important one to address. It's a very important, first of all, it's very important to measure people who are being excluded, and then to find the right mechanisms to provide them the measures to get included. But I would say, just taking a technology lens over here, right? Why is it so important for us to have this conversation about inclusion at this point of time? And this goes beyond ID. This just goes to the level of digitization that's happening across the world right now. Most of the countries that are present in this conference, and many, many more, are taking the path of digitizing services for citizens. Very, very basic services to more sort of complex, sophisticated services, right? And those countries are more and more taking the path of using digital public infrastructure as the mechanism through which they will provide those services, right? So therefore, the question there is that if majority of the services for citizens at scale, we're talking about the entire population, are going to be digitized, then what happens to the people who don't have access to technology? And people who don't have access to the technology are excluded from services, but it's not as simple or linear as that, right? It's a pathway, because technology keeps getting complex, technology keeps evolving, and people who've been excluded from the foundational layer will be the ones who'll sort of suffer by exclusion as technology progresses, right? We're talking about, simple access to telecom services. Then we're talking about access to ID. Then we're talking about access to all of the services that ID can provide. And now Kunal was mentioning, we're talking about AI as well, right? AI is now going to become, is being said to solve the sort of big challenges of society faces. So that's one side of why we need to measure inclusion. The other side that I often find missing in the conversation is the private sector lens, right? Because I often find that we have a discussion around exclusion or inclusion with governments, with civil society, with technologists, like DPGs, etc. But the private sector is missing in that conversation. And the private sector typically drives a lot of the services. And whenever we speak, in our experience at Dalberg, whenever we speak to the private sector about inclusion, the need to take on inclusion as a big topic, the main question we get is, what is the business value, right? And what's the business case for inclusion? And I think first of all, that's a very valid question, and that needs to be addressed, right? We've done some work with fintech companies across the world in just articulating the value of getting more women to use services. And it's true, there's a business case over there. If you get more women, the typical perception is that the cost of acquisition for getting more women to use loan products is very high. That's true. But the long-term value, because women are just better customers, it's a well-known fact. The ROI is much higher. So that piece of the conversation is something that we, through our work, try and bring in, because it has to be a holistic approach. It has to be involving the private sector as well.
Thank you very much for that. In fact, I should refer to one of the pieces written by a philanthropist in India, Rohini Nilekani, where she talks about Samaj, Sarkar and Bazaar, which is society, government and market, and the importance of all three coming together to actually affect any kind of whole of society change. And in fact, at Aapti, we genuinely believe that change in the context of technology is networked, which means that different actors need to play different roles. And your point is very valid. I'd love to come back to that as well. But Andrew, coming to you, I'd like to double click on a few of the things you said. Firstly, around the importance of thinking about the policy and the operational framework around ID systems. And I'd also love to hear from your experience over many years, what it takes to build these systems to be actually effective for communities that are displaced and hence extremely marginal.
I think to answer that question, it's habit in a way, because after all these years, you learn what works and what doesn't. It's also a recognition that it isn't always about the tools, right? We have to make sure that we're building processes that are understood by those who benefit from them. We have to make sure that the user community is able to use the platforms that we're trying to implement. And so, yeah, I think that really we need to be really sure that the systems are built to serve. Now, there hasn't been much said about risk here, I feel. And the kind of risk that refugees face is different than others, right? There's a session across the way, just next door to us, on sharing data across borders. But what does that mean for a refugee? What does it mean if data goes back to a government that they're running away from? And or if it's a dysfunctional state, what could that mean for many people who don't want that data shared back to where they're running away from? So there are risks associated with that, and I think that when looking at integration and interoperability, we really have to think about risk and how sharing data inappropriately can result in really negative outcomes. And yet, if it's done properly, they're very, very exciting stories. And they all speak for themselves, right? I mean, you get incredible benefit by being able to join social programs, by being able to open a business. Each one of these attributes of identity, I guess, and inclusion are so compelling that I feel that we really have to work in the direction of ensuring that we're joining up together. So in the implementation, for example, of the FIDA system in Ethiopia, where refugees were included, what really kind of worked, I think, was the convening of all the stakeholders, where we had data protection folks alongside operational managers, alongside developers, and really a community of practitioners who are able to come together and build the data sharing agreements, the regulatory frameworks, the rules under which the systems and the provision of services will work. And so that's why I feel, for example, with Ethiopia, there was such a great success for refugees. And there's a lot of really good videos online about how refugees are able to integrate in society in Addis and other locations around the country. So, yeah, great benefits.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I wish we could have a whole hour of conversation about risk. I think that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about. But definitely for everybody to look up the learnings from Ethiopia and the work around it. I'd like to bring the conversation back to you, Kunal, around the market, and start to move the discussion a little bit towards the how. I'd love to understand from your perspective how different stakeholders can come together. What do they require in terms of the glue that will hold them together? What do they require in terms of the tools that they need to use on the ground to make this sort of inclusion dream very much a reality?
Yeah. I mean, it's a process. There's no one answer to that. I guess the first step is to really understand why people are being excluded. And the drivers for different stakeholders might be different, but the reasons why people are being excluded are common, and so I think that would probably be the first step, and then really coming together to design solutions. I think that's where a lot of the collaboration needs to happen. You can't have a civil society organization helping sort of design a program to address exclusion without having the service providers on board, right? So therefore, we need to anchor them around, the stakeholders around common principles of solutions. I think that's where people need to come together. And if I had to sort of talk about the types of solutions that we've seen work over here, it's definitely not just a technology challenge. And I think that's where we, again, sort of go wrong. DPGs, for example, have a huge role to play in making their products inclusive. There's no doubt about that. But they alone cannot solve the challenge, right? You have to involve product people into the conversation, right? A lot of the barriers around exclusion are related to the design of the product. I mean, we've done a lot of work where we understand, and I'm sure you guys have also, that the way low-income consumers interact with internet or digital services is so different from what we do, right? We have for example, e-commerce platform. We have a simple put in your cart type of prompt, right? And people don't know in low-income communities what a cart is. That's just one simple example, right? So that's where product people need to get involved from the private sector on how to design these solutions. The third, I would say, the kind of stakeholder that needs to be involved is the government. Because unsurprisingly, again, from our work, we did a national-wide survey in India very recently, last year, which told us that almost 60% of new internet users coming online in India, and these are mostly low-income users, 60% either do not see any value in the internet or actually see the internet as a negative thing. That's a huge number, 60% of those people coming online. And one of the main drivers for that is the amount of misinformation, the amount of harm that can be caused to people, right? So the government needs to come in with a lens of policy, redressal systems, and sort of things like that, right? And finally, it's a lot about cultural behaviors, right? If you're designing products and solutions, or if you're designing an ID system in a particular country for low-income communities, for women in rural areas, where the women has to actually step out of the house and get an ID system, most likely it's not going to work in a lot of countries, because mobility is a huge challenge for women, right? So these are these socio-cultural barriers that need to be addressed as well. So, sorry, to go back to your answer, to your question, stakeholders need to align around the solutions, and they need to come together to design solutions, because I believe that's the only way that these solutions will be effective.
Thank you very much for that. I'm hearing themes of people need to come together from both of you, and that very many of the solutions around some of the challenges with technology actually lie in society. I'm going to bring the conversation to you, Kunal, to hear from your perspective again a little bit more of the how in the context of gender. So how do we start to unpack, for example, barriers at the societal level? And then how do we also, to Andrew's point, go from the process of giving identity to actually downstream in terms of use of identity systems to actually benefit from greater participation in society, greater participation in market, greater ability to engage with the state, etc. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on the how.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think step one would genuinely, I think, be very realistic about where we are, right? I think that we as a society, as people involved in the ecosystem, I think we make a lot of assumptions and we start understanding a lot of these problem areas as assumptions based only. I think really understanding where we are, so taking stock of the different ways in which challenges kind of emerge, addressing them, and then I think overcoming them over time is something that, I mean, in a very simple sort of process orientation way, is the way to do it. Identifying where these challenges emerge, sort of looking at the counterfactuals or looking at the counterweights of them to see what are the things that people may have been able to do. And a lot of the research that we've done shows that people kind of come together to overcome a lot of these challenges, right, themselves. So what are the ways in that, where that's happening, maybe to reduce that over time or to kind of strengthen it? I think a big part of the research that we did recognized intermediaries as a very integral part. So in the societal component of systems like this, how can you actually recognize and formalize relationships with intermediaries and last mile sort of intermediaries in on-ground communities as well? I think second is that once you've started identifying where these challenges are, and of course there's a variety of different tools, and like you said, it's not just the identification, it's also the the sort of creating a strategy, creating a joint solution. I think that's what we're all talking about today. Building that out together, building that in a way that is robust, that is inclusive of all the different types of stakeholder groups, communities. I think that's step 2. And then, of course, the third part of it is operationalizing it, making sure that there's continuous, frequent communication, feedback that keeps happening so that the system in itself gets stronger. And I think that's something that we've seen across a variety of different paradigm shifting systems over the last sort of 2-3 decades, is that the role kind of continues to strengthen, or it kind of continues to evolve, but the sort of involvement of it stays the same. Everyone should continue to kind of be that way. That's a little bit on the how, and of course that's a very sort of brief way, because I mean I can speak about how to do it, over time, but sort of the second question around what are the ways it can kind of create access is that we've seen a lot of improvement downstream. We've seen a lot of ways in which transformative systems have actually seen positive impacts. I think to sit here and talk about just the challenges of it all or just the risks of it all is also fairly one-sided. Not saying that all systems are, made of the purest loincloth and stuff, but there are downstream implications or positive implications that we have seen as well. So actually focusing on those, strengthening those, I think that would be the kind of way forward, is to use the core principles of that and then using that principle-based approach to actually strengthen the other emerging challenges that come out of it. And in a very simply put way, I think, is if you're seeing something good, try and replicate it. If you're not seeing something good, then try and see how to strengthen it using other voices. I think that's something that we've been trying to sort of build up here as well. But yeah, I hope that helps answer the question.
I think it does. I feel like I'm hearing some similar themes and points of nuance in the different views here. But we could open up the floor for questions. We have a few minutes and we can take a couple of questions before we wrap. And of course, all the panelists are there all of the 3 days, so you can catch anybody at any point. But if there's any questions, please. Any questions? Don't want to hold anybody back from coffee, but if there's any questions, please. Yes, of course. I think somebody will bring the mic to you. Yeah.
In a lot of the developing world, when a foundational ID is being created, it relies heavily on legacy documentation. We need legacy documentation to try and validate who the person is, where the person lives, and so on. And then these become important because later on they are like a gold standard for who the person is and to a lesser extent where he is. Do you see challenges in undocumented people within a country? I'm not just talking about refugees here. I'm talking about large communities who essentially are, for example, herders. People who migrate, they migrate even cross borders sometimes. And it's very difficult for them to give an address. So how do you see challenges in, for example, there are some countries which, like India for instance, which takes the national identity document also as a proof of address, which is not really valid. So do you see challenges around that at the foundational stage to determine who and where?
Thank you for that question. I'll ask Andrew to take it. But your name, sir, very quickly.
I'm Sudarshan Sen.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Thanks very much. I think the issue of evidence of identity is a really tough one for many populations, right? And we look at our processes internally, at least in our organization, where considerable work has to be done to try and get to the true identity of that person. And often when identity is mixed with benefit provision, you can get a repeated identity, right? You can get duplication because people essentially are going back to the end of the queue again. So there are many populations that I've worked with where the additional benefit results in duplication of identity, and that's problematic. But the very problem of foundational identity, I think, and the lack of breeder documents to initiate the locking or the anchoring of the identity is hugely problematic for refugees. And I would imagine that, like you say, herders and so on. In summary, I think what we have to do is make an extra effort and give, well, we are a humanitarian agency, so we have to give a certain benefit of the doubt as well in our interaction on identity. But I feel that we try, but it's not a perfect world, and I don't know if any of the other panelists want to contribute, but I think, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, agreed on the first part, but it's also a very deeply political question, right? There is a pretty large amount of policy that needs to be there in order to kind of overcome some of the existing marginalization as well. You're also not going to be able to create or recreate documents and things like that that doesn't exist. So even in the research that we've done, the biggest challenge happens to be access, like challenges around access, documentation. I think Kunal mentioned access to sort of the resources as well, right? That is the biggest usual challenge, and we see that particularly with women, especially in sort of androcentric structures where marginalization continues to exist. So the answer is sort of multifold. There's behavioral change that takes years, which is something that we're seeing in very staggered ways, but not enough. There's the policy side of things, which start thinking about how can you overcome the sort of barriers. I think we saw in Ethiopia that they were using the sort of single point of truth policy, in which if you didn't have an ID prior to today, you can now use the FIDA ID going forward as the thing, and that's all that would be required. And they would loosen up the pre-documentation requirements and sort of take anything, and even through a nomination process. I am part of a community and have an ID, so I can forward someone who doesn't have an ID or documentation. And then, of course, it's the role of the implementing authority as well, is that how do you start making processes simple enough, and how do you articulate that process so that people who even, let's say, don't have necessarily the wherewithal, or you can have the documents and still not be able to get the ID for a variety of different reasons, right? So how do you make that process downstream actually easier is something, let's say, that sticks maybe a little bit more with the implementing authority. So in addition to, I think, the sort of people who have maybe a bit tougher in terms of explaining context, with people within the context also it's not easy as well. So I just wanted to add that point too.
No, thank you for those points. I think there's another question. Sorry? There's one there. Could we club them together? So we'll hear from the lady at the back, and then the question here as well. And then we'll take them all together. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Nara Keita from Côte d'Ivoire. I want to express in French. Okay.
1 second, ma'am. We just get...
Mon intervention n'est pas une question, mais plutôt une préoccupation. Je suis d'un pays à forte immigration et le problème de l'identité se pose effectivement comme une barrière, c'est pour ça que je suis à ce panel. Et nous avons eu la chance de bénéficier d'un financement de la Banque mondiale à travers le projet Ouvri depuis 2018, qu'il s'agit de délivrer des documents, des identifiants uniques à toute la population sans discrimination de religion, de nationalité et à toutes les personnes. Mais malheureusement, le projet peine à décoller parce que la volonté politique n'accompagne pas toujours. Mais il s'agit vraiment d'un projet qui pourrait intéresser tous ceux qui sont dans la même situation pour briser les barrières d'accès aux services sociaux de base. Parce qu'avec le projet Ouvri, il s'agit d'un identifiant unique un QR code qui permet d'identifier tout le monde et qui permet d'accéder à tous les services sociaux de base, sans, bien évidemment sans exclusion des droits des nationaux. C'était ma contribution.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We'll take the question from here and then direct it to the panel.
My name is Braulio. I'm from Angola. Vou falar em português. Eu gostaria de saber dos oradores como superar os desafios da falta de conectividade nas zonas rurais e da falta de literacia digital, garantindo que as camadas mais vulneráveis não sejam excluídas do acesso à identidade digital.
Okay, is Braulio is from Angola, yes, and he wants to know how to overcome the challenges of info exclusion and digital literacy, and to assure that the most vulnerable people are not excluded from the digital ID system or digital, yes, from ID systems.
Got it. I'd ask all the panelists to take that question in turn, as well as the observation from the lady there. But Kunal, do you want to start with?
Sure, I think if I'm reading this correctly, and I'm responding in English, but it was about how to build political will, if I'm not mistaken, and how do you sort of strengthen that, and then of course some of the challenges to overcome exclusionary. I think the political will, I think, is something that we're seeing across the globe as shifting. There is, of course, a business case. There is, of course, a value statement that comes out, which is that in order for you to want to be more sort of citizen and resident friendly, you end up putting in place systems that are actually beneficial for the people residing. How do you sort of build that political will is, of course, I mean, democratic systems tend to be a bit representative, also not. I'm sorry for the extremely controversial statement on that, but essentially that's kind of how you have to start working at building stronger policies. Like CSOs have to, think about how to be part of the system, on-ground community, self-help groups. It's a village approach. It's not just can we convince one elected representative to drive this forward. It's in addition to that. So I think that's one way is that we've seen that political will can be strengthened. And in terms of sort of how do you overcome these barriers, so to speak. So there are solutions or enablers being put in place by the people already in the system. For example, in Ethiopia, we saw that print shops that are sort of local sort of areas where people convene, they end up doing a lot of the digital literacy upskilling themselves without being recognized by the system. So there's people already putting things in place. There's a government authority response that also happens. So I think with the Philippines, there's a lot of islands to cover. So how do you bring in sort of a mobile kit that goes from door to door, and you engage the postal service to go and actually get the registrations done. So you see that side of it as well. And then of course you see the changes in place, let's say by stakeholders outside of that, is that you build easier systems to move, registration kits, they evolve. You try and sort of put in place practices, and this is all from the from the interaction side, so not the technical side as much, but you start seeing a lot of different stakeholders playing different roles. So it's a community effort. It's never going to be one solution fits all, and it's not going to be one problem that helps answer all the problems. It is a long drawn process, and it is something that needs continuous effort. Sorry for that. It's too long.
Yes, Kunal.
I'll just add to the second answer on digital literacy. I think one of the things that we've seen work a lot in developing countries is voice-enabled services. So digital literacy is a big challenge. People are not able to sort of read and write. However, what we've seen is a lot of people in rural communities are interacting with the internet using voice. even using YouTube and the sort of mic button on YouTube and asking questions. So it's very important to for digital service providers to embed voice functionality in their services and in regional dialects. That's the second important thing, right? So that's more of a design solution, and the third one, I think Andrew touched upon this, is not directly digital literacy, but it's about awareness. A lot of times people are just not enrolling themselves in ID or any kind of digital services because they don't see the value. They just don't see the value. Life is good as it is right now. So for a lot of people, as they think, and while life cannot be improved by digital ID or any other service, so a lot of awareness campaigns in sort of addressing the value that you can get out of that.
I thought to follow up on this, I might make a plug for verifiable credentials, because they can really appear as a QR code on a piece of paper, right? So where digital, using a device becomes problematic, at least we've seen that we can provide documentation that is trusted and that binds the identity to the person who's presenting it. And it doesn't answer all the questions, but it's a rudimentary way of ensuring that there's some trust in the ecosystem. J'oserais pas parler en français, je manque de pratique, alors je vais vous répondre en anglais. The statement from Côte d'Ivoire on working towards, I think what was it? Political will, right? And looking at ways that states can, create more momentum behind identity. I think one of the answers is frankly money, and we've seen in many locations where enough resources really come into play to be able to do a sort of whole of ecosystem response to an identity effort within national boundaries. So this is what the world of donors and stakeholders are for. So hopefully that might come in to help your country a little bit more than it's being helped currently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel like this could have gone on for much longer, but I hear a few common themes around multi-stakeholderism, around sort of a complete look at the value chain of ID implementation, which is starting from getting ID to actually being able to use it, and questions around the policy and the legal layer, all of which I hope carry forward into conversations over dinner today and over the next couple of days as well. But thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing these talks. Thank you. Thank you very much.